A single railroad track cuts through a gorge in southern West Virginia. It is the only way in. No road connects this town to the outside world for the first 50 years of its life. No bridge, no highway, nothing but steel rails threading between a river and a wall of rock. At its peak, this half-mile of track generated more freight revenue than the rail yards of Cincinnati and Richmond combined. 15 passenger trains rolled through every single day. 75,000 travelers a year stepped onto its platform. 2 banks operated here. 2 hotels. A red light district with its own private mythology. Today the census counts 5 people. Not 500. 5. The buildings are still standing. The bank is still there, its windows dark. The depot still receives a train 3 times a week, and almost nobody gets off. This is Thurmond, West Virginia. And the story of how it went from one of the wealthiest rail junctions in America to a town you could lose in an afternoon walk is not a simple story of coal running out. It's a story about 2 men who hated each other, a hotel that burned down under suspicious circumstances, and a technology that made an entire way of life obsolete almost overnight. To understand what happened here, you have to go back to 1873. Friends, as you can see, many people watch and enjoy our videos, but most of them haven't subscribed to our channel yet. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. Thank you. When a Confederate cavalry veteran named William Dabney Thurmond bought 73 acres along a half-finished railway line in the New River Gorge. He was not a builder of empires by temperament. He was a strict Baptist, a man who despised drinking, gambling, and the kind of behavior that came with railroad boomtowns. He wanted a respectable settlement. He got something else entirely. The land he'd purchased sat directly on the route of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, and underneath the mountains around it lay some of the richest coal seams in Appalachia. Within a generation, that combination, rail access plus coal, would make Thurmond one of the most profitable few acres of land in the eastern United States. But profit brought people. And people brought problems Captain Thurmond had never planned for. By 1910, the town he founded had become the chief switching and revenue hub on the entire C&O mainline. The numbers were almost absurd for a town this size. More freight tonnage moved through Thurmond than through the yards of 2 major American cities put together. Coal barons did business here. Bank vaults filled with cash from mine sales worth over $1 million. An extraordinary sum for the era. On paper, it looked like the beginning of something permanent. It wasn't. Because just across the river from Captain Thurmond's dry, disciplined town, a rival family was building something he could never control. Thomas McKell had married into land on the opposite bank, and he had none of Thurmond's moral restrictions. Where the captain banned alcohol outright, McKell built a hotel. Not just any hotel. A sprawling 4-story wooden resort called the Dun Glen, opened in 1901, with a bar that never closed and a reputation that spread far beyond West Virginia. The district that grew up around it earned a nickname, the Dodge City of the East. Saloons lined one side of the street. Brothels lined the other. Miners, railroad crews, and wealthy mine operators poured in together, and violence became common enough that it was simply part of how outsiders described the place. Robberies, shootings, a card game in the Dun Glen's backroom that reportedly ran without stopping for 14 straight years, a claim later recorded in Ripley's Believe It or Not. Captain Thurmond was reportedly mortified. He had built a town meant to reflect his own values. Instead, his name had become permanently attached to a den of vice he didn't own and couldn't shut down. That should have been a footnote. A colorful chapter in the story of a boomtown. Instead, it was a warning sign nobody in Thurmond was positioned to read. Because a town built on a single industry, connected to the world by a single rail line, governed by 2 feuding families with opposite values, was never as stable as its revenue numbers suggested. The first crack came from Washington. In 1920, national prohibition took effect, and the saloons on the south side, the ones that had made Thurmond famous or infamous across the region, were legally wiped out overnight. The Dun Glen kept operating, but it was never quite the same. The wild economy of vice that had funded so much of the town's secondary income simply stopped. Then came 1930. The Dun Glen Hotel burned to the ground. Investigators at the time pointed to arson. No one was ever definitively brought to justice for it. The hotel that had put Thurmond on the national map, that had hosted the largest coal transaction in the region's history, that had run a poker game longer than most marriages, it was gone in a single night. At the time, it might have looked survivable. Thurmond still had its railroad, still had its banks, it still had coal coming out of the mountains around it. But the fire had exposed something the town's leaders didn't want to see. Thurmond's prosperity had never really been diversified. It had one economic engine, coal moving by rail. And everything else, the hotels, the vice district, the banks, was built on top of that single pillar. And then the Depression hit. The Thurmond National Bank, Captain Thurmond's own institution, closed its doors in 1931. 4 years later, the McKell family's bank, the one rival institution that had survived the fire, survived Prohibition, survived the crash, packed up and relocated to a nearby town. Both families that had built Thurmond, and had spent decades competing over what kind of place it would become, were now gone from it entirely. By the middle of the 20th century, the moral and financial rivalry that had defined the town's entire personality had simply evaporated. What was left was a rail yard. And rail yards, it turned out, were about to become disposable. Through the 1940s, the C&O still ran steam locomotives through Thurmond, and steam locomotives needed something diesel engines don't: constant servicing, coaling towers, water towers, repair crews, switching yards full of workers keeping an aging fleet of machines alive mile by mile. Thurmond existed in large part because steam trains needed a town like it to survive the journey through the gorge. Then, in the 1950s, the railroads switched to diesel. Diesel locomotives didn't need coaling towers. They didn't need the small army of laborers Thurmond had once employed to keep steam engines running. A technology shift that took railroads across the entire country less than a decade to complete quietly eliminated the exact function that had justified Thurmond's existence in the first place. There was no single dramatic event this time. No fire, no crash, no headline. Just fewer jobs year after year. Families who had lived in Thurmond for 2 or 3 generations packed up because the work that had brought their grandparents there had simply stopped being work anyone needed done. By the 1960s, the transformation was complete. A town that had once moved more freight than Cincinnati and Richmond combined had become, for most practical purposes, empty. What's left today is one of the strangest preserved places in America, a ghost town that is still, technically, a functioning municipality. Thurmond remains incorporated. It still has a mayor and a city council, governing a population that could fit around a single dinner table. The National Park Service began acquiring the town's buildings starting in the late 1970s, eventually taking ownership of roughly 80% of the historic district as part of the new River Gorge National Park and Preserve. Stabilization work began in earnest in 2003. Not full restoration, but the slower, more careful process of keeping century-old wooden and brick structures from collapsing into the gorge entirely. The old depot, rebuilt in brick after an earlier fire destroyed the original 1888 structure, now operates seasonally as a visitor center. Amtrak still stops here, 3 days a week, on the same rails that once carried 75,000 passengers a year through this exact spot. Walk the main street today and the storefronts are still labeled. The bank building still bears its name over the door. You can stand where the Dun Glen Hotel once hosted million-dollar coal deals and a 14-year poker game, and see nothing but river grass and the outline of a foundation. The deeper truth about Thurmond isn't really about coal or fire or diesel engines. Those were the mechanisms. The underlying cause was structural, and it's a pattern that shows up again and again in American company towns. A settlement built entirely around a single industry, controlled by a small number of families with no shared vision for what the place should become, is never as permanent as its balance sheet suggests. Captain Thurmond wanted a sober, disciplined town. The McKell family wanted a profitable spectacle. Neither of them was building for a future beyond their own generation. And neither of them accounted for a world where the trains that made their town necessary might simply stop needing it. The irony is almost too clean to be real. A town founded by a man who hated vice became famous, nationally, for exactly the kind of vice he despised. And it was the destruction of that vice district by fire that marked the beginning of the end. The dry captain and the indulgent hotelier turned out to be locked in the same economic fate, whether either of them wanted to admit it or not. Today, Thurmond exists in a strange in-between state. Not abandoned enough to be forgotten, not populated enough to be a real town. Preserved by a federal agency that has no interest in what either founding family believed, maintained as a monument to an economy that vanished faster than anyone standing on that platform in 1910 could have imagined. The rails are still there. The train still comes 3 times a week right on schedule. Almost nobody is waiting for it.